Hello, everyone. Welcome to Connecting with Ideas 101. What are the chances? What we had just done in this class was talk about strategies for effective learning. And we talked about reducing interference and spacing things out and breaking things up. We had the whole and part method. We talked about recitation, which I said was very, very, very important. And now we are on a section on how to no, this is use a study system, and this is a strategy for effective learning. Some of you may have seen this. Once in a while, this will get taught in some sort of 8th grade class, but for the most part, students haven't seen this, and I think it's a big tragedy because it means you've wasted a lot of time in the decades, more than a decade of schooling that you have had so far. And the thing that they never taught you was how to read a book. And you're thinking, of course they taught me how to read. How did I get through school if I didn't know how to read? Let me change this just a little bit then. Here's what they didn't teach you. What we're really teaching you is how to read a textbook. And reading a textbook takes some special skills. And the method we will use is called SQ3R. This is not the only method. There are lots of different methods that are possible. SQ3R, I think, is as good as any of the rest. Although I will tell you that Darren Olson, who works in the Center for Teaching and Learning here at CWI, insists that SQ4R is better. And so we've had discussions on that. I think SQ3R is just as good. And it has fewer letters. So the idea here is SQ3R is obviously a mnemonic. It's an anagram, right, for 5 different words. There will be 5 steps in this. The first step will start with an S, and then the second step will start with a Q, and then the last 3 steps will each start with R, just as you probably suspected. So here's our first step. Starting with an S, this is survey. And sometimes you'll see this. Higby's not the inventor. He's not the only one who's written about it. Sometimes you'll see this called skim. So survey or skim. And the idea here is you're not reading the book yet. And this is kind of an important point to note, is that when you read an ordinary book, if you want to read, your favorite novel, your favorite author, J.K. Rowling or someone like that, you pick up the book and you open to page 1 and you start reading and you sit in a comfortable spot and you enjoy it as much as you can. And that's the whole point of reading a book. Reading a textbook is different. You're reading a textbook in order to learn something, in order to remember something. So the first thing you do is not start reading, you survey. So the way this is described is you go through the book, and don't read it yet. That's not what you want to do. You're looking at the stuff. You're getting a feel for it. You're skimming it. You are reading the headings. So read the headings, look at them, and do look at the illustrations and read the captions to the illustrations. And illustrations, what that would include, graphs and tables and things like that. Some books, most textbooks nowadays, also will have little summaries, and sometimes the summaries come before and sometimes they come after. And so you will also look at little summaries. And sometimes at the end of a section there will be little review questions, maybe at the end of each subsection, maybe at the end of the chapter. And these are book questions, book summaries. As you are skimming, right, and your eyes are just kind of flying over the page looking at stuff, you're not reading yet, you will notice that some words stand out because they are boldface or they are italicized. Maybe they're in a box, right? You'll have a little box. Some of my math books have little boxes where they define words. And you do want to look at these. And so you might read a couple sentences, right? You're not reading the book, but you're skimming. What else does Higbee say? Study the outline, skim the chapter, especially the headings, pictures, and graphs. Surveying consists of getting an overview of what the book or chapter is about and should not take more than a few minutes. Many books have a summary at the end of each chapter. I think I mentioned that. Reading this summary before you read the chapter may help you get an overview. The overview is somewhat like looking at a map before taking a trip or at a picture of the finished product before starting to put together a jigsaw puzzle. Surveying gives a framework within which to place the parts as you learn them, which not only can make the parts easier to remember, but also can speed up your reading time by allowing you to comprehend the parts more rapidly. If you know what it's about already, it's a lot easier to understand and you can read it a lot faster. And Higbee gives this great example. So here's a paragraph. I'm going to read this paragraph and imagine this were something in a textbook, something you had to learn, something you have to remember. And this is a passage about a process. So here I'm going to read it to you. The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. It is important not to overdo things. That is, it is better to do too few things at once than too many. After the procedure is completed, arrange the materials into different groups again. They can then be put in their appropriate places. Eventually, they will be used once more, and the whole cycle will then have to be repeated. Wait, what? Yeah, that was it. That was it. Do you remember it? Could you repeat it? Could you describe it? Could you regurgitate it on a test if we asked you about this procedure? And my guess is that you're just totally lost. You're groping in the dark. Well, let me give you a little hint. Let me give you an overview. This is about doing laundry, washing clothes. Let me read it again. The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. It is important not to overdo things. That is, it is better to do too few things at once than too many. After the procedure is completed, arrange the materials into different groups again. They can then be put in their appropriate places. Eventually, they will be used once more, and the whole cycle will then have to be repeated. And you realize, I hope this works for you. I like this example because when you first read it, it's just like a bunch of words. And the second time, everything makes sense. Everything click, click, click just falls into place. You understand it better and you remember it better because you have a general idea of what it's about. And so this survey really, really helps. Research, of course, Higbee's going to have lots of research and footnotes, and he talks about lots of studies. There are things, I guess, plural, called advance organizers. And these are methods that give an introduction or overview of material to be studied. For example, a summary or outline to look over before studying. And these are really, really, really good. And most textbook authors now have these in their book. So for example, in my statistics book, at the start of each chapter, there's a page, half a page, where it says, here are the 5 sections in this chapter. Here's what they are about. And I really encourage you, using this method, to look at things like that. I use the analogy, it plows your brain, right? It plows your mind so that the seeds of knowledge can more easily be planted. If you just scatter the seeds on a fallow field or a field that's overgrown with other stuff, it's not going to help. But if you have nice rows, and the advanced organizers give you the rows. If the book doesn't actually have them, well, that's okay, because what did you do? You looked at the headings, and so you already know the headings. If you do not use the headings, Higbee says, you are failing to take advantage of an important source for learning the material. Using text headings can aid both in understanding and remembering textbooks. And the same thing for pictures and graphs. Higbee points out that despite what you might think, they don't throw in the pictures just so it doesn't look like a chapter book. Oh, we have to read all of this. There's no pictures. And so they put in pictures. No, that's not why they put in pictures. The textbook authors, it's expensive to put in a picture. I mean, compared to the text, oh my gosh, I used to be in the publishing business, and I can tell you, the illustrations, if you can publish without any, you are so much happier. And I can remember when my partner would come in and talk about, oh, the art guy is done, and I just would roll my eyes. No, the pictures are there to help explain the material. So illustrations are very, very important. Don't skip over them, and don't skip reading the captions. And in fact, looking at the pictures and reading the captions ahead of time is, I think, an important part of surveying. Second step of these 5, you know it starts with a Q. This is called question. And the idea is, as you are skimming, you're looking at the headings, you're looking at the emphasized words, you're looking at the organization of the section, the chapter, you are creating your own questions. So create questions from your skimming. And we already mentioned that some books already have questions for you, but this is you engaging with the material. What do they call it? Connecting with ideas. Yeah, so here's the name of this course. And you are connecting with ideas. You're thinking up your own questions. So for example, you think, I don't know how to make questions. I've never done this. And most of you haven't. More's the pity. If you read a heading, well, what does it mean? It's very likely that a heading of brand new material might use vocabulary that you don't know. And so one of your questions might be, what does this word mean? In general, what is the section about? So you can expand on what you think it's about. And you don't know yet because you haven't read it, but you've read the heading. And then you have these boldface and italicized words. And what do they mean? You might notice people's names, right? They stand out because they're capitalized. And so you might ask yourself, who is this joker? Who is this person that they've mentioned? You might notice numbers, right? Maybe it's a history book and you're spotting, oh, there are some dates in here. Well, what happened in those dates? And these are all sorts of questions. And why are the questions valuable? Because of all the things we've done in the last couple weeks, talking about memory and how it works and what makes it work better. And if you create questions, you're maintaining interest. Interest, we saw, was one of the basic principles of memory. It focuses your attention, and attention, we know, is absolutely necessary to memory. It fosters active involvement. It gives a purpose to your reading. All of this helps you learn the material. I'm kind of summarizing what Higbee is saying. Also, and I've mentioned this, some textbooks provide review questions at the end of the chapter. You might try reading them before reading the chapter, and you think, well, how can I answer the questions? No, not yet. This step is called create questions. You are not answering any questions. You don't know the answers because you haven't read the material. If you do already know the material, I mean, I used to have a friend. She was kind of a student of mine. I guess she thought of me as a mentor, and I taught her this, and she couldn't believe how much time it saved her. She said, no one ever taught me to read a textbook. I just read the textbook. And no, if all you do is, the professor says, read chapter 3 for next week, and then you go home and you sit down in a chair and you read chapter 3, well, you haven't learned anything. And you all had this experience where you read chapter 3 and 10 minutes later or the next morning, but very, very soon, you don't remember any of it. And then you go to the lecture and the professor says, okay, so in chapter 3 it said, and you think it said stuff, I don't remember any of this. And it discourages you, right? And you decide, there's no point in reading the book because I don't understand the book, evidently, because when he talks about it, I don't remember any of this. And so you quit, and that doesn't make things better. It makes things worse. But anyway, this young lady was just astonished. And I told her at one point, I said, always read the questions at the end of the chapter. And if you actually know the answers to all the questions, well, then you're done. you've just saved yourself enough time. Some things you do already know because of your life experience, or because you learned them in a high school class or a junior high class, or maybe it's your hobby, you do something for fun and you happen to know about whatever it is you're reading. If you already know it, well then great, you can save yourself some time. You're done reading if you can answer the questions. But in general, what you're doing here is creating questions to foster your interest and help your mind focus on the material. Take advantage of the test effect. And this test effect is an amazing, amazing thing. And I know somewhere in Higby's book, he gives this example where researchers were studying the psychology of memory, and they had people come in, volunteers, and they split them into two groups. In the first group, they said, what we are going to do is we are going to teach you some Hungarian vocabulary words, right? And it's like, that's new to me. I know a couple languages, but I don't know any Hungarian. I don't think I know a single word. I know Magyar. There you go. That's the only word I know in Hungarian. It means Hungarian. Yeah, right. I don't know if that's of any use in a conversation. If I'm ever lost in Hungary, I wake up one morning and I find myself there. Anyway, so they're teaching people Hungarian vocabulary words, which are brand new to them. And they give them the words and they give them the English meanings, and they say, study this for an hour and then come back in a week and we'll test you. So they come back in a week and they test them. And anyway, that's the first group. The second group comes in and they say, we're doing an experiment on memory. We are going to teach you some Hungarian vocabulary words. Next week, there will be a test. But before you start, we're going to give you an initial test. And the reaction is always, wait, what? You're giving me a test? I don't know any Hungarian words. Why would I mean, I'm not going to do very well on this test. Well, do the best you can. Here's the test, and it'll take 10 or 15 minutes. And the volunteers take this test, and of course they blow it. How many Hungarian words did they know? None. And then what? Part of their hour is used up. Well, now study the rest of the time after you've failed this test. Study the rest of the time on these Hungarian vocabulary words. And then when you're done, when your hour is up, we'll see you in a week and we'll see how you do. The people who do the test first, and this is why it's called the test effect, score double or triple the people who didn't, right? And so creating these questions and struggling with your mind, right? This is what Dinner and Olson calls effortful remembering. Just makes such a huge difference in the amount of learning that goes on. And that's the whole point of reading the textbook. If you're reading textbooks and you're not remembering anything, then yes, you are wasting your time. And a lot of students don't remember anything because they have no training in memory or how to read a book. And they feel reading the textbook is a waste of my time, so I'm not going to do it. And I have to honestly agree, yeah, it is wasting your time. And the reason is they're doing it wrong. If they do it right, then hey, they do remember the stuff, and it's a very valuable use of their time. We are on to the third method, and of course it starts with an R. The last three start with R's. And so finally you get to read the book. And notice, reading is the third step. It is not the first step. If you read a textbook at the first step, you are doing it wrong. You are wasting your time. Higby says, some students think that when they have run their eyes over the textbook, they have studied it. Nope. He mentions, after reading this section on SQ3R, one of my memory students commented that he used the 3R method: read, read, and reread. Well, that doesn't help, right? We saw that repetition can be valuable, but it's not going to do as much as, yeah. So read. Finally, you get to read. And Higby recommends, and I recommend, read without taking notes. This is your first reading, and you might do more than one reading. But you have these questions in your mind that you created, and they might just be in your mind. Even better if in the cue step, the question step, if you were able to jot down the questions. And this is kind of like the the left column, if you're using the Cornell note-taking methods, right, you create questions and they help you review. Anyway, you have some questions either in your mind or written out. And you answer these questions as you're reading. You're paying attention and looking for stuff. And again, I will emphasize that you read everything. You don't skip stuff because this is the reading stuff, the reading step. And so you are reading, and a lot of students will skip stuff, especially I found students will skip captions and graphs. And for one thing, they help you understand. And for another thing, I know a lot of professors who do pull questions from those bits. So it says without taking notes. What about underlining? And so Higby has this long thing, and I'm going to read it to you. Underlining while reading is a very popular learning tactic among high school and college students. Research on the effectiveness of underlining shows that it can help people get more from their reading, if it is done right. But there are several ways that students can misuse underlining. One misuse is to read a chapter and underline, and then only review the underlined parts in studying for a test. One problem with this approach is that you usually do not know what is important or what relates to what the first time you read a chapter. Thus, when you review the underlined parts, you may miss much of what is important because you didn't underline the right things. How could you? You don't know what the right things are. Underlining while you are reading for the first time also has other problems. It is easy to do, so most students underline too much. This results in reviewing pages that have marked not only the important points, but also repeated and conflicting points. Another problem, Higby goes on, with underlining the first time through is that some students develop the habit of reading to mark important points rather than reading to understand and remember the points. And I love this example he gives. Thus, a student may underline an italicized sentence. Obviously, it's important, right? It's underlined. And continue reading without having even read the italicized sentence. Yeah, they marked it, they highlighted it, they underlined it, but they didn't actually read it. And think about yourself, right? To use underlining properly, you should wait until reaching the end of a section before underlining. Think about what the important points were and then go back and underline only the key phrases. Underlining the wrong things may actually interfere with learning. And so this is why I said read without taking notes. The idea here is you're not underlining yet. You're not writing things down because you kind of don't know what you should be writing down. You don't know the important stuff yet. My own self, just to share and I'm different from everybody else, my attitude always in this class is try everything that I suggest, and the things that work, keep doing those things, and the things that don't, well, why would you do something that doesn't work? And I make no requirement that you keep doing things my way. Example, I just mentioned the Cornell note-taking method. I have had students who insist that the reason they got through high school was the Cornell note-taking method, and they think it's the best thing they ever learned in junior high. Your mileage may vary. My own self, I don't use the Cornell method. It doesn't work as well for me. There's nothing wrong with it. If it works, great. I usually use an outline method. So that was the reading R. We're on to the second R, the fourth step. And this is one that we've mentioned. This is near and dear to my heart. This is recitation, recite. And recite means, what does he say? Recitation is discussed as a separate strategy, so you'll remember it from last week. What you are doing in reciting is you are rereading, and you came up with questions, and you are asking yourself these questions. And reread here doesn't mean you start at the first page and you move your eyes across the line, down the page, and then you go to the next page. No, what it means is you're really reading. I always say this isn't reading with your eyes. Step 3 was reading with your eyes. This is reading with your hand. And I suggest your hand. I usually have one of my hands with me. In fact, I often have both, so they're convenient. And if you don't want to use a hand, I sometimes have used little note cards, although we have all these devices now. I've quit carrying little note cards, but my typical thing that I do, one of those Gary things, is the first time I open a book, I get a blank piece of paper. And what I do is I fold it in half and I stick it in the book. And that becomes my bookmark. And it's also handy because it's big enough that I can take notes on things if there is something I especially want to make note of as I'm reading. But it's also the thing I use for the recitation. And so I have this big piece of paper. And the nice thing about this big piece of paper is I can use it, and otherwise I use my hand if I don't have a piece of paper handy, and I cover up everything so that I can just see the heading. And I see the heading and I read it and I think of what questions I had from that heading, and I recite, I recall, I review, I pull from my memory the answers to those questions, and also what is this section about? Here's this heading, give me more details. And I do spend a minute or two on that, and then I move the page down or move my hand down, and I can read the stuff and go, oh yeah, I forgot about that person. I forgot that detail. So this rereading, this recitation. And this is an important step. We talked about recitation before, and I said, what did we have? I don't know, 10 different basic principles of memory. And I said, if you don't do any of these but one, the one you should do is recitation. So recitation is very, very important. Do not skip it. You will cheat yourself out of a lot of the learning, right? The first time you read stuff, you don't remember it. And that's just how the brain works. Don't think any less of yourself. That's just how it works. Recitation is what helps your brain. It's the effortful remembering. We're to the 5th step. This is the 3rd R. This is review. And again, we've talked about how memories do fade, memories do decay. You'll forget stuff over time. And so a little later, yeah, I love how Higbee says, and think to yourself of what you've been reading in Harry Lorraine's Page a Minute memory book. And I think that Higbee is talking about Harry Lorraine, actually. Higbee says, and I quote, "Review is a very basic learning strategy that is often overlooked in popular memory books. Some authors give the impression that if you just use the right technique, theirs, to learn something, you will never forget it. The fact is that no matter how you learn something, if you do not use it occasionally, you are likely to forget it unless you review it." And he mentions a bunch of studies and how people, anyway, yeah, obviously review is helpful. It works. And if it's not obvious, he has footnotes. You could look them up. To use a review as a part of SQ3R, what you do is you survey again. And so I'm typing survey again, reviewing what you can recite, and noting what you can't. It's like a survey, right? You're going through the book. I'm pointing at things. It's like a survey. You're going through the book, you're looking at the headings, and you're reciting, right? And why don't you call this recite? Well, because this happens later. This happens a week later, or a month later, or 6 years later, or whenever it is that you need to do reviews. It's the day before the test, right? And we are hoping that you aren't reading the textbook for the first time the day before the test. Where were we? Survey again, reviewing what you can recite and noting what you can't. And I mentioned reviews and when you should do them, so let's talk about when those times should be. The best times to review are, and we'll give you a couple, while you're studying. So what is this? You're using this SQ3R method. You do the survey, you do the question, you do the read during study. So this is while you're reading it the first time. And this first recitation, right? Because these are the steps. You've surveyed, you've questioned, you've started reading, you finish a section. And I should have said this recitation, don't wait till the very end of your reading. You might do it at the end of each paragraph even, right? But certainly every section with a header. You pause and you recite, and that really is your first review. You're reciting after you read a main section. After you have studied, after you've read it for the first time, review is great. I always tell students, this is something I invented myself, but it really, really helps, is you go through a class and you finish your class, and if you're not sitting at home in your kitchen table, you're at school wearing a mask, or maybe later not wearing a mask, wouldn't that be nice? You sit through a class, it goes an hour and 15 minutes, or if it's a Wednesday night class, it might be 2 or 3 hours. And then you're driving home and you're thinking, oh, I'm so glad I'm done with that. And you turn on the radio because there's something to take your mind off. And I always recommend, don't take your mind off. This is the perfect time for review. You got 10 or 20 minutes and you really aren't doing anything else. Yes, I can listen to the radio. Well, don't this time. Try it out and see what happens. And as you're driving home, review, right? You're driving home and you think, well, okay, what was that about? Well, it was about American history. And well, when was it? It was the Civil War. It was the 1860s. Oh yeah, 1860s. Oh yeah. When was the Civil War? And again, what you are doing here as you're talking through the class on your way home, you're reviewing what you can recite because some things stood out to you and you remember those. And you're also noting what you can't. And you think to yourself, okay, so I know it was the 1860s, but I don't know the exact date. I probably should know that. And you notice it, and it kind of sets your mind up, right? This is the neuroplasticity is happening. Your mind is rebuilding to help you remember. So immediately after saying, as you're going home, this isn't reading a book, but it's sitting through a class and think about what you just learned, or what you're not driving home, but you're walking across campus, you're walking through a building to another class or to the library. And if you spend 5 or 10 minutes, and that might be the 5 or 10 minutes it takes you to walk to the next place, and you just think about it in your mind, this is a very, very valuable review. The third best time to review, and this one I think is obvious, but sometimes students don't do it, just before the exam. And we want to emphasize somewhere here, spaced reviews, we talked about this. Spaced reviews are better than continuous or massed reviews. A review immediately after studying helps you consolidate the material in your memory. A later review helps you relearn forgotten material. One study found that having one review immediately after learning and one a week later was more effective. It was also more effective than 2 reviews immediately after learning or 2 reviews a week later. So if you can do an immediate review, great, and then put off the next review. So don't review twice, the first time you read something. Many students have reported, I'm reading again, a saving in study effort by the following rule. Never finish a reading session without reviewing in outline the main points of what has just been read. This rule has been found by many students to be the most important single step to reduce forgetting. Not only does it help you see what you have learned, but it also helps you learn the material further before forgetting it, because we know that forgetting happens soon after you learn something. In addition, such review does save time and effort. Because you remember more, you do not have to spend so much time rereading and reviewing the material for the exam later. And then he spends a couple paragraphs on a couple studies, some research that was done, and then this paragraph is important. Note that reviewing just before an exam, this is what we're talking about now, review just before the exam. This is different from cramming for the exam. The key word in the difference is new. If the material you are studying is new to you, you're learning it for the first time, then you are cramming, and that's kind of a waste of time because cramming doesn't stick. It won't help you. If it is not new, you're going over what you have studied before, then you are reviewing. Although a final review just before the exam is recommended, cramming is not. And you think, yeah, but the time, and this is why before I give you this stuff, I give you the unit on time management. This section on reviewing, Higbee says, applies to lecture or reading notes as well as to textbooks. So when you take your notes, there are two possible benefits. One is you are encoding, right? You're putting the material in your own words in order to write it down. And that helps because, again, you're connecting with ideas, you're engaging with the material. And then the external storage function is the benefit that, well, you can read it later. It's stored externally, so you can review it. When my students come to my office, this is Higbee, to talk about an exam they have taken, I ask them to bring their class notes with them. I often find that their notes have the answers to several of the questions they missed. They took good notes, but did not study them well enough. So word to the wise. So spaced review, we just mentioned that. Let's put that down because it's important enough to emphasize. Recall that spaced review is best. Next time I'll talk about some software, some applications that will help you with spaced review if you're interested in that. Gradually increasing intervals are best. So once immediately after, and once, say, a week later, and then maybe 2 weeks later, then a month later, and then right before the exam. About how long a semester lasts, right? 16 weeks. So if you spread it out, 1 week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 8 weeks, that's probably just before the midterm, and then again just before the final exam. So there's the SQ3R method, and I apologize on behalf of all of your previous teachers. I apologize that they may not have taught you this before, and if you did have a teacher who taught you this, then you can thank them. You should send them a little note card. Send them a Christmas card in a few weeks and let them know how valuable it was, because I'm sure it made a difference. And those of you who are seeing this for the first time, well, now you can read a book and actually learn from it, which, what's the thing? It's a slogan. It's not a silly slogan. It's not just a cliche. It's probably the most central thing of everything you do in college. And you've seen it on the syllabuses, right? Learn to learn. If you can learn to learn, that's the most valuable skill you have. Because, well, for one thing, I don't know everything, so I can't teach you everything. And there are lots of things you want to learn that you might, if you can teach yourself, if you can learn to learn. And it might involve finding the person, right? Yeah, if you can find someone who can teach you, then great. But then you still have to learn it. And it might involve finding a book. It might involve finding YouTube videos. My wife is a master of learning things from YouTube videos. It astonishes me what she can do after watching a few hours of videos. But learning to learn is very, very valuable. And this, I think, is one of the central things to it, how to read a book. And I can remember working at a big electronics firm. I was a software engineer in their R&D lab, and it was a whole comedy of errors because the first day I went in and they had decided in the couple weeks between when they hired me and when I showed up for work to actually give me a different job. And so I had a different supervisor and a different role, and everything was different. And then the comedy of errors continues. I show up and no one had mentioned to the rest of my new supervisor's team that a new hire was coming on. So here I was, and comedy of errors continues. This guy was on vacation and he hadn't mentioned to anyone, oh, there's a new person coming. So I walk in and they tell me, you're working for Greg. And I say, no, I'm not working for Greg. I'm working for another fellow. And they say, no, you're working for Greg. And I say, no, call the fellow, because they tried Greg on the phone and couldn't get him. On the paper, it said, you're working for Greg, but Greg didn't answer the phone. Well, yeah, he was in Nebraska or something. And finally, the guy who hired me comes down, and I say, yeah, see? And he walks up and shakes my hand and says, yeah, you're working for Greg. And I'm thinking, wait, what? And I go upstairs, and he says, well, here's Greg's desk. I'm not sure where he is, but sit down right there. Anyway, back to the topic. The topic was learning to learn. And the first thing they did, the first day was kind of a waste because no one had any idea what was going on. But Greg did come back, and he handed me 2 5-inch binders. I mean, the biggest binders you've ever seen, huge rings, and said, this is the small computer systems interface. You're going to become our expert on it. Read this. And there were 2 of these, and it was just very dense material. And luckily, I knew how to learn. And so I actually did very, very well. And a couple months later, I was actually giving classes in the small computer systems interface, and they were recording my classes and sharing them with engineers in Japan and Italy. And this was the days when that was a lot of trouble. I mean, nowadays you think, yeah, it's YouTube. There wasn't any internet then. The cameras were big things that had to sit on tripods. But this is very important stuff. How well do the principles and strategies work? This is a summary of this, not only this chapter on effective learning study skills, but it's also kind of a summary of this half of the book. And what happens is we're on page 93 of a 200-page book. The last 40 or 50 pages are footnotes. We're halfway through, and so now you've learned about memory, and the rest of Higby's book is mnemonics, and you're learning mnemonics on your own reading Harry Lorraine's Page a Minute Memory book. And so I'm not going to do much directly from Higby's book. We'll talk about mnemonics, and we have that activity coming up where you will create your own mnemonic and share it with your classmates. But here, this is kind of the summary. It's a real short little section. It's a page and a half. Talking about the principles and strategies that we've discussed over the last several weeks. And the experiment was that they gave students 7 memory rules. And so here they come. These are the 7 memory rules used in the research. And the people in this research, the students in this research, were taught this, and it was a pretty brief, I mean, they spent a lot less time than we have spent going over it, over these rules. And we'll tie these rules together with what we've actually learned. And the experiment was one group was instructed in the 7 rules and then given 3 hours of practice using the rules. A second group also practiced memorizing for 3 hours, but they weren't given any instruction. Here's how to memorize, here's how to visualize, here's how to make associations, here's how your memory works. They were just said, here, spend 3 hours, memorize. And they had all kinds of material: poetry, prose, facts, foreign languages, historical dates. The instructed group did about 8 times better. This is like, oh yeah, okay, so this does work. And here are the 7 rules that were given. The first one was learn by wholes, and we talked about whole learning versus part learning. Whole learning, and this is also learning by wholes. If you think back to what we just did an hour ago, this is the survey step of the SQ3R method. So learn by wholes. Use active self-testing was the second thing these students were taught, and this is recitation. And it's also, Higby doesn't mention it. I wonder why not. It's also the feedback, right? We talked about feedback as being a basic principle of memory. The third was to use rhythm and grouping, and we talked about that when we talked about meaningfulness, rhythm and rhyme and things like this. were ways of making things meaningful, and organization, we talked about different ways to organize material. And grouping would certainly be one. We mentioned it. Pay attention to meaning and take advantages. Picturing, this is what they called it for the students. And again, this is the meaningfulness and the visualization. The fifth one was mental alertness. This starts to bug me. I don't know, I'm too picky. I get annoyed because the first one is a verb, learn by holes, and the second one, use active self-testing. It's a verb. And then here's number 5, mental alertness and concentration. Yeah, what about it? What? So I'm annoyed. You could fix it in your own notes. I used to be in the publishing business. I was an editor, and I would always fix things like this. It's called faulty parallelism. I would be jumping up and down. I wouldn't. I would just fix it very quietly and quickly, efficiently. Number 6 of the 7 rules they taught these kids, and this is also faulty parallelism, the use of secondary association. And this is the association we talked about. You're learning that not only in Higby's book, but also in Harry Lorraine's book. And then the last one, the confidence you have in your ability to memorize. And I hope that the last few weeks learning about memorization, you are more confident. And that has 2 benefits. One is the relaxation. Remember that memory has an affective component. The part of your brain that makes memory work is also the part of your brain that reacts to emotional things. And so if you are stressed out, if you are anxious, do not be surprised that your memory shuts down. And this is one of the reasons you want the confidence. You want to do the SQ3R method. You want to read and review and recite, because then when you're sitting at the test, you think to yourself, I got this. And if you think I've got this and you do got it, then it works. And if you have studied and you're worried that you ain't got this, then the affective component kicks in, and you've all been in that sort of spiral where, oh man, I know this and I just can't think of it. And you get more worried. Oh no, and I don't know this next thing, because your brain is methodically shutting down in reaction to your stress. So relaxation is an important one. Overlearning. So confidence in ability to memorize, this means you will spend some time memorizing things because you're confident that it works, and overlearning has great positive effects.